So, I finally have an excuse to break open the lore of Dragalia Lost again with the upcoming event Forgotten Truths. The event trailer kind of had me confused though, as it showed Ilian with the phrase, "I'll create an organization, no, a religion." This immediately struck me as odd, as practical religions are not just things you make up, but are instead a discovery of truth in how the world works and what lies beyond that which we can prove. The first problem with Ilian simply making up a religion is the present-day Ilian Church as shown in Dragalia Lost. The Ilian Church has a lot of parallels to Christianity, and I've even noticed some specific Catholic traditions. Examples include Estelle preaching lines from 1 Corinthians about love, and Hope talking about hearing confessions. The issue lies in the fact that if there is no equivalent of heaven or hell, then there is no parallel salvation, and Ciela from the Agito is actually correct, as it wouldn't matter how someone chooses to live. That brings me to my next point: what happens when people die in Gristea? We have a couple of glimpses of this from several adventurer stories, chief among them Sophie's. In Sophie's adventurer story, we find out that when people die, their souls are returned to Mana and are left to roam the world in such form, carried by the winds. We also know from her story that souls in this form keep a semblance of their consciousness from life to likely a large extent, and are able to recognize the world around them and affect magical happenings. So what does this have to do with Ilian and salvation? Well, the initial line to draw is that Ilian is a parallel to Jesus, saving humanity in the First War of Binding. But what does that have to do with salvation? Well, I think the answer has less to do with what Ilian does as the goddess and more to do with what she did during the war. The other key component to consider is dragons. We have dragons such as Elysium the Holy Worm, Chthonius the Netherworm, and Tartarus the Abyssal Worm. This sparks several questions, as holy by definition means consecrated or set aside for religious purposes, which makes little sense if the Ilian Church isn't actually a valid religion, and if souls become mana, then what would be the Nether and the Abyss for those who have died? Well, in Catholicism, hell is less of a place and more of a state of being where one's soul is completely cut off from God, heaven being the opposite of complete union with God. I think this may have a parallel in Dragalia Lost regarding souls that have passed on to mana form. We know from many different sources, including the main campaign, that dragons are responsible for governing the mana of the world, and often have a domain they oversee. So if souls become mana after death, it would only make sense that dragons can interact with them and keep them safe. We see an advanced version of this in Chapter 5 of the main campaign. So then, safe from what? We also know that there are other powerful beings, such as the Ancient One, which takes sacrifices collected by loyal Nyarlathotep. Tampering humans might also get a hold of a wandering soul and use it in unspeakable ways. So what does this have to do with Ilian? Well, the First War of Binding began as a war between humans and dragons. It's yet unclear how the war began and how long it was going before Ilian showed up, but it likely sparked from humans heavily disrespecting dragons and mana. Humans, being weaker by form than dragons, were probably on the losing end more than they wanted to be, and decided to go down an even darker path to turn the tides, and they summoned the other, more Sayadi. Based on what we've seen and can infer, humans probably quickly realized that this was a mistake, and dragons agreed. So Ilian teamed up with Elysium to make the first Dragon Pact, creating the primal pactstone between the dragon race and the human race, and the origins of dragon blood. See Chapter 2, 5-3 for Megardsimer's explanation on this. So we know this ended the war, but where did the Ilian Church come from? Well, it's likely that in learning about each other, Ilian discovered that humans become mana after death, and dragons have the power to govern mana. This is why a good relationship between humans and dragons would be really important, which itself is called Dragalia. This would also be an important truth of the world that Ilian would need to spread about the world, and hence created the Ilian Church. The primal pactstone was handed over to the Ilian Church to be protected over the ages, and we also know from Tobias's adventurer story that respecting dragons is a really important teaching of the Ilian Church. This is likely because dragons watch over the souls of the deceased and protect them after death, including dragons such as the aforementioned Netherworm and Abyssal Worm. Nidhogg even takes a particular interest in death. So next question, is Ilian a goddess or a right place, right time human? She undoubtedly holds up the name of her church by the action she took, and it makes sense that it's named in her honor. But if she's not a goddess, why worship her? Well, we have a couple of options. The first one is to take another step toward Christianity, and Ilian was the human incarnation of what present Gristea worships as Ilian. Whether she started as human and became a goddess, or was always an incarnation, is unclear. Another option is that Ilian did die, but by her relationship with Elysium or the action she took while she was alive, manages to have a great deal of magical power after death as mana, possibly residing in or with Elysium. The other option is that she's still alive to the day like Alberius, which brings me to my next bit of evidence. We know that in the Second War of Binding 300 years ago, Alberius received a sacred sword from Ilian. We don't know how, but we do know that the sword is indeed holy, was recognized by the other, was used to successfully seal the other, and was broken into pieces to create the sacred shards to guard the land from the other's return. This fact reveals that Ilian does indeed still have the power to interact with the world, and still seeks to protect it. In the end, I cannot yet say if Ilian is goddess or not, but based on the lore presented in the game, her church checks out. One thing I noticed while rereading the Dragalia Lost chapter snippet is that the primal pactstone was intentionally destroyed by both humans and dragons working together to avert catastrophe during the Second War of Binding. But that's a theory for another time. In the meantime, we have Forgotten Truths to look forward to, or we might finally learn just who Ilian is.